Hey everyone, welcome. Today we're diving into an analysis of a case that is, well, it's deeply disturbing, but absolutely crucial to understand. We're looking at the historical reality of Jeffrey Dahmer. This isn't just a basic rundown of events. We're really going to unpack how these horrific crimes were allowed to happen, what completely broke down in society, and most importantly, the devastating human cost. Picture this scene. It's July 22nd, 1991 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. A man is literally sprinting down the street. He's completely terrified, totally out of breath, and dangling from one of his wrists is a partially open pair of handcuffs. His name was Tracy Edwards, and right behind him, just a calm, ordinary-looking guy wearing glasses. At first, the cops thought, okay, minor dispute, we'll break it up. But when they traced Edwards' steps back to a nearby apartment, those officers were about to uncover what would soon be called the most horrifying crime scene in American history. All right, let's dive right into Section 1, Uncovering the Horrific Truth. So inside that apartment, investigators didn't just find a standard crime scene. They walked into an absolute house of horrors that exposed a meticulously kept secret: 17. That is a stark, devastating number. For years, Jeffrey Dahmer operated completely in the shadows, totally deceiving the police and the public alike, and ultimately claiming the lives of 17 innocent people. Now, you're probably wondering, how on earth does someone commit 17 murders over a decade and not get caught? Well, it really comes down to this terrifying contrast. To the outside world, this guy seemed incredibly quiet, utterly ordinary, completely harmless, right? But the hidden reality, as the source material clearly outlines, was completely consumed by dark obsessions, a history of dissecting animals, and this deeply disturbing compulsion to commit horrific crimes. It's a chilling reminder that the most dangerous monsters usually don't look like monsters at all. Moving right along to Section 2, A Dark Childhood. Let's trace this timeline back a bit, starting in 1960. Born in Milwaukee, Jeffrey was a very quiet kid. His dad was a chemist, his mom struggled with emotional issues, so the home environment was pretty tense. And as he grew up, so did this completely abnormal fascination with dead animals, bones, and decomposition. By his teenage years, he was totally socially isolated and relying heavily on alcohol. I mean, he was even showing up to school intoxicated. Then we hit 1978. The very same year his parents divorce, an 18-year-old Dahmer picks up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Out of a sudden panic that Hicks was going to leave him alone, Dahmer committed his very first murder. He disposed of the remains in the woods, marking the terrifying beginning of a decades-long nightmare. Which brings us to Section 3, the silent killer and police failures. After that first murder, there was actually a shocking gap in time before the violence returned. And this brings up the massive question that really haunts this entire historical analysis. Why couldn't the police catch him for so many years? Between 1987 and 1991, his crimes escalated incredibly fast, yet he just kept slipping through the cracks. To understand why, we have to look at exactly how he operated. Dahmer had developed this chillingly cold, calculated routine. He would target young men at very public spots. We're talking bars, malls, bus stops, and he'd lure them back to his apartment with promises of money or a photo shoot. Once they were there, he would drug their drinks so they'd pass out before murdering them. But horrifyingly, he didn't stop there. He had this gruesome compulsion to preserve their body parts. He actually later told the police he did this because he literally wanted to keep his victims with him permanently. Once the absolutely horrific details of these crimes came out, including things like preserving skulls and other unthinkable acts, the American media obviously latched on. They quickly gave him these terrifying nicknames. He became known worldwide as the Milwaukee Cannibal and the Milwaukee Monster. As you can imagine, the sheer scale and the totally unthinkable nature of these crimes caused widespread public panic. But here is the really crucial, profoundly tragic part of how he evaded capture for so long. Dahmer intentionally targeted individuals from minority backgrounds and the gay community, and historical sources point out a pretty devastating reality here. Missing persons reports from these marginalized communities were frequently ignored or just not taken seriously by the police during this era. Basically, society's own blind spots became the killer's ultimate shields. And the absolute most heartbreaking consequence of those systemic blind spots, it really comes down to one single number: 14. That was the age of Konerak Sinthasomphone, one of Dahmer's victims. The circumstances surrounding what happened to this young boy remain one of the absolute darkest stains on the entire history of American law enforcement.
This tragic reality brilliantly, or rather tragically, illustrates the massive blind spot we just talked about. On May 27, 1991, witnesses spotted 14-year-old Konerak out on the street. He was naked, confused, and just completely terrified. They did the right thing. They called the police. But when the officers showed up, Dahmer came out too, and he falsely, sickeningly claimed the child was his adult boyfriend and that they were just having a lover's quarrel. And shockingly, instead of protecting this incredibly vulnerable child from a predator, the officers actually accepted Dahmer's word over the obvious distress of the boy. They literally escorted the 14-year-old directly back into his killer's apartment. Konerak was murdered just hours later. It was a catastrophic, completely unforgivable failure that enabled horrific violence.
Moving into Section 4, the trial and death in prison.
So that fatal police encounter happened in May 1991. Just 2 months later is when Tracy Edwards made his daring escape, finally bringing this nightmare to an end and forcing a legal reckoning. Now, the 1992 trial absolutely gripped the entire nation. It was a fierce legal battle centered on one main question. The defense argued that Dahmer was mentally insane, basically saying he couldn't control his compulsions and didn't really grasp the gravity of his actions. The prosecution, on the flip side, argued the exact opposite. They said he was perfectly aware, highly calculating, and knew exactly what he was doing every step of the way to evade capture. The trial brought out horrifying evidence and just utterly heartbreaking testimonies from the victims' families that were broadcast heavily across the media.
In the end, the jury made their decision. They found Jeffrey Dahmer legally sane. For his horrific crimes, he was handed 16 life sentences. Practically speaking, this guaranteed he was going to spend the absolute remainder of his natural life locked away behind bars.
But as it turned out, that life behind bars was pretty brief. On November 28, 1994, inside the Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, Dahmer was brutally attacked and killed by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver. Dahmer was only 34 years old. His violent death immediately sparked an intense public debate. Some people saw it as the ultimate justice, while others argued that violence simply begot more violence. But regardless of where you stand on that, his life was over, cementing his incredibly dark legacy in criminal history. Let's move to our final part, Section 5, the major lessons of this case. Okay, so we've gone through the really grim facts of his life and his crimes. But honestly, an explainer of this magnitude can't just end with the killer dying in prison. We've got to shift our focus away from the perpetrator and look at what society absolutely must learn from this profound tragedy. The crucial point here is that this case exposed massive fractures in society. I mean, it highlighted lethal police negligence and deeply ingrained biases. It showed the deadly cost of ignoring missing persons reports, especially when they came from marginalized groups. It fueled all sorts of complex debates around criminal psychology and mental illness. But above all, it revealed these systemic, societal blind spots. Experts pretty much universally agree today that if warning signs had been taken seriously and if all communities were protected equally, a lot of innocent lives could have been saved. As we wrap up this analysis, we really need to keep this quote in mind. True crime isn't just about killers. It's about the victims whose lives were stolen. We study these historical cases not to glorify the monsters, not at all. We do it to honor the 17 individuals who had their futures tragically taken from them, and to make sure that the systemic failures that let them down are never repeated. I want to leave you guys with one final, kind of provocative thought. Jeffrey Dahmer survived, and really he thrived, in the shadows precisely because he looked so ordinary and harmless. It really forces us to ask, since the most dangerous monsters can look completely ordinary, what signs is society still missing today? Think about that for a second. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, stay observant, and I'll catch you next time.